External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar on Tuesday said that recognizing the legitimate interests of partners along with respecting international law is key to building a durable world order. Jaishankar was speaking at the special foreign minister level meeting of the trilateral group of Russia, India, China, which was being held through video conference due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The initial remarks of the three foreign ministers were televised live, after which they switched to closed-door discussions. The meeting took place in the backdrop of ongoing border tensions between India and China. Since the special meeting was held to mark 75 years of the victory over the Axis powers, Jaishankar began by reminding both Russia and China that 2.3 million Indian troops had helped the Allies win the Second World War. On this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyze the key takeaways of the trilateral meet. Joining me on the program today are Vishnu Prakash, former ambassador, Shakti Sinha, strategic expert, and Swaran Singh, chairperson, Center for International Politics, JNU. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. All right, Ambassador, let me begin the program with you first. After initial reluctance of India to join this particular trilateral meeting, Russia showed a great deal of interest really in ensuring the foreign ministers' RIC meet took place. Why is that so?
Well, if you look at the background, the RIC process was initiated by Prime Minister Primakov in the 90s, and Russia had conceived it. This was a period of after the Cold War, where the geostrategic ties were still evolving. Russia, China, and India did not have the kind of dynamism, the depth in the relationship that it had with the Western world. Russia-India relations were much stronger. China was not that antagonistic, and there was a commonality of interests in carving out a multipolar world order, in ensuring that important countries like Russia, India, China get their space in the world. So that is how it originated, and since then a lot of water has flown down the river Thames, so to say, and Russia's position has been altered. It is under diplomatic pressure. It has forged a tactical alliance with China. Russia is trying to carve out a niche for itself. Russia is also trying to play a bigger role in affairs in our region and beyond. So it was at their request that we decided to join. Clearly, as somebody mentioned, India's heart was not in the meeting, and it had come just in the aftermath, or while we are still in the midst of the stare down or the difficulties with China. And you have just noted what External Affairs Minister said, which was quite significant, that it is not a question of the norms, it's a question of intent, and certain basic international norms need to be followed to move forward in a way that is conducive to peace and prosperity.
Absolutely. Professor, let me bring you into the picture now. From your perspective, and someone who's been watching these developments take place over the years and who's been keeping a close eye, what were the key takeaways for you from the first virtual RIC meet?
I think if you want to point out the direct takeaways from it, we noticed that yes, after the June 15th night incident in Eastern Ladakh, the first talk between Indian Foreign Minister Jaishankar and the Chinese counterpart Wang Yi happened on 17th June. In that meeting, the subject of activating the working mechanism for consultation and coordination on the border affairs was mentioned. And that finally the date for today was fixed in this meeting of the three foreign ministers, which is how the direct outcome of this can be seen. The date for the meeting after 2019 January for the working mechanism for consultation and coordination on border affairs for today was discussed there, or was finalized there. That's a direct outcome. And then there are several indirect outcomes. For instance, Russia which, as Ambassador just now mentioned, was the kind of brain behind this RIC originally being conceived of. Today, if China and India are not on the same page, then Russia gets into bigger trouble, because Russia today holds the presidency of not only RIC, but also BRICS and Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Now, these are three very significant groupings which provide a kind of a counterbalance to the global order vis-a-vis the United States-led Western world. And Russia's traction, visibility, influence lies in ensuring that these groups continue to function. So it was primarily the compulsions of Russians that they wanted to make sure that this event happens, and somehow they can help to see the China-India come, sort of back to the talking table, which they are on their own already there. India, China have both made very clear, whether it is President Trump or it's Russia, they don't want any mediation from anybody. They have enough mechanisms, they have enough sort of mutual bonds at various levels to constantly talk, from the border, where military leaders are talking to the foreign ministers, and now I said the working mechanism for consultation and coordination meeting today. So I think there is a kind of an interest that all three had in this. But India definitely wanted to delay it, because you remember this was supposed to happen in March. And we were getting into COVID-19 at that time. And that was a clear situation of business not usual. And then, of course, we got into this border tension. So India wanted to make sure that everybody understands it's not business as usual. But Russian compulsions, I believe, are the reason why the meeting finally happened. And I think that's what Ambassador just now also mentioned.
Okay, all right. So, Mr. Sinha, so what good has this meeting done for these three countries, that is Russia, India, and China, and what does it mean for multilateralism as a whole?
I think one very good thing it has done is there's a lot of ambiguity in India about the role of Russia. The fact is, as was mentioned also, Russia has entered into a tactical alliance with China for very obvious reasons. Russia feels it's pressurized by the United States and more so by Western Europe, whether over Ukraine and other stuff. And therefore, they do not want that the India-China relationship should deteriorate to the extent where India becomes literally an ally of the United States. As Mr. Very rightly mentioned, in 1999, when Primakov, and that was the time of the unipolar moment of the USA, Primakov still in Delhi at Hyderabad House suggested this idea of India, Russia, China coming together, because the Russians feel that they need peace in Eurasia. They need the three great Eurasian powers to be at comfort with each other so that outside powers are not there, and that would enable Russia much greater space in the world. So I think Russia yesterday, and after the meeting, Primakov's briefing to the press, statements before, one made it clear that it wants India to be in the Security Council, supportive of the idea. Two, that India and China have the mechanisms for working it out, and therefore there is no need for any outside power to get into the situation. And the fact that even in this situation, the fact that India and China could Russia sit down together, I guess was sending a message that despite our misgiving, and we have very good legitimate misgivings about it, despite that, countries like India and Russia do need some space of their own. And in that sense, the meeting, I think, this is the really positive thing that comes out of it. Not that it will immediately solve the problem of Ladakh with China. It will not. This is a long-term thing. But at least it puts some kind of a damper on that Russia did not come out against India in any manner whatsoever. So I think that is a big positive.
Okay. All right. So taking the discussion forward now, the finance minister, ambassador, also spoke of building a durable world order. What role do you see these three countries playing in a global new world order?
I want to speak with candor. I'm not very sure whether RIC is a platform where we can talk of building a new world order, for the simple reason that China plays an important role or is a member of RIC, and China is quite determined to carve out a China-centric world order. And we have just seen that China has thrown out of the window all the arrangements, all agreements, all undertakings that had been with a lot of effort, bilateral understandings which had been put together in the last 35 years. So the question is, how can we, or to what extent can we have a meaningful conversation with China on constructing a new world order, when it is very clear that China has worked incessantly against India's interests. China talks of being targeted, but China has spared no stone to contain India. And now we see that even that pretense is off. So I am not a great fan of RIC in its present form. Having said that, with Russia, we do have a very important relationship. Although, like anything, relationships evolve. Even with Russia, relationship has evolved. We note that Russia is supplying arms to Pakistan. We do see a nuance. There has been a nuancing of Russia's outlook on the Indian state of Jammu and Kashmir. There is a strong relationship between Russia and China. So this is a period of a lot of recalibration of ties. How things will evolve is anybody's guess, but I'm not sure that RIC is a platform where we can have meaningful discussions, frank discussions, constructive discussions on looking at setting up a new world order.
Okay, all right, Professor. So, since we are talking about Russia, India, and China, and as a whole, do you believe the bilateral relationship or the differences between India and China at this point in time can jeopardize the goals of the RIC?
Absolutely. In fact, if you look at the time RIC was conceived of, China and India were roughly around $300 billion economies. Today, India is hitting almost $3 trillion. China is hitting $13.7 trillion. It's a very different China and India today. And increasingly, it becomes Russian compulsions, which is just $1.8 trillion economy. Of course, they are seen still as the older superpower. Russian compulsion to make sure that they keep India and China closely knitted together. And let me also, put my neck out slightly and say Russia was perhaps also now trying to rectify its tilting far too much towards China. We know that, Chinese have not recognized annexation of Crimea, for example. Last week only, the Russians have really slapped charges on one of the Russian scientists in Tallinn Maritime University for passing on secrets about Arctic to Chinese. So it's not all well between China-Russia relations. In fact, look at the oil prices crashing. They're looking for new buyers. So Russia has its own reasons also to keep both these countries closely knitted in its own network of people. And RIC is actually the core of BRICS and of Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So three countries, if they have a good consultation of how they want to influence the global order in coming times, they can use larger platforms of BRICS and then still larger group called Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So I think there is still certain relevance of RIC as the three countries work together, particularly because of the unpredictability of President Donald Trump, who's very likely to come back to White House as they believe. So I think there is still relevance, except that equations that Primakov saw in 1990s are no longer the same, and therefore there is an enormous transformation that is happening within RIC, and then of course the advantage that they can together build on BRICS and SCO and other global platforms, including India joining next January the UN Security Council as non-permanent member, which will again see Russia, China, India sitting in the UN Security Council. So I would not kind of rule out that RIC is not relevant. But except equations are completely changing now. Russia has to really fine-tune those equations.
Talking about equations, talking about Russia, talking about the United States, Russia and the US seem to be looking at this whole Indo-China issue very, very differently, Shakti Sinha. President Trump is openly saying that, there is a problem between these two countries. We are going to openly speak to both of them and we are going to sort out this problem. Whereas on the other hand, Russia is suggesting that this is an internal matter between India and China and it is best left up to them and they need to deal with it accordingly. So these two differences of opinions really clearly coming through as far as this issue is concerned.
Absolutely. In fact, the Americans have even let it out that they have spoken to the Chinese already about it, since they are in negotiations with this comprehensive trade deal. They have said, they have mentioned it. Now, just to carry on what has been very rightly said, Russia feels it has gone too much towards the Chinese side. And as the supreme realist Marsheimer said, in the long run, Russia's interests and China's interests collide actually, and Russia and America will find themselves ultimately in the long run on the same side. Now, Russia, whether it's on Afghanistan, whether it's Pakistan, they're taking part in the exercises inside Pakistan, in POK, etc. I guess had saw that it was losing out leverage to India completely, and they've decided to do a bit of course correction, especially because even today, the Chinese market is only 15% of their global trade. 40+% of Russia's global trade is with Europe. So China has not moved into that space that Russia thought it would. One, of course, the Chinese heartland is very far away from the Russian heartland. So economically, it is difficult for them to get very close. But I think even strategically, Russia feels that vis-a-vis Europe and America, it should not be seen as riding along with the Chinese completely. It will constrain their freedom of action. So they would definitely like to have a pushback on that. And therefore, they are very keen that nothing happens between India and China that will push these two countries so far apart that Russia would have to take sides. The last thing Russia wants to do, as we saw in 62, is take sides. 71, they did, of course, very openly take a side. We signed the agreement. That's a different world altogether. Now the world is completely changed. Russia would want Eurasia, at least, to be at peace so that they can concentrate on their western frontiers and not get bogged down in a dispute in this part of the world. Hence, the two attitudes, are Russian and American, would be very, very different.
Absolutely. All right, taking the discussion forward and bringing in another aspect, something that we raised a little earlier in the program as well. Ambassador, in your experience, why are bilateral issues kept out of multilateral meets? Especially the RIC is very, very particular about keeping bilateral issues out.
Well, there are two aspects. One is the stated position, and then there is the reality. First of all, the stated position very much is that bilateral issues should be kept out, and for the reason being that there is let's talk of RIC, for example. There are three important countries, large countries. We don't have a direct border with Russia, but China has borders with both countries. And we have, with India, Russia, and perhaps to a lesser extent with China, we have some convergences, but also divergences. So if we start bringing the bilateral contentious issues during these discussions, then it kind of hijacks the agenda, the core agenda of a forum. And the core agenda of RIC is supposed to be that these three large countries, important countries, should coordinate positions on global economic, trade, political, security matters, and take stock of the global situation, etc., speak in one voice. But bilateral issues on the sidelines, on the margins, in informal discussions are bound to come up, because how can you separate the core issues of a country from, let's say, global issues? After all, the country's position on global issues is also shaped by its bilateral experience with a certain country. So I don't think that there are any watertight compartments, and I have been I have sat in a number of meetings. On the margins, you have a lot of discussions going. But yes, informally speaking, it makes sense to say, or to have the core agenda not being impacted by bilateral considerations.
Okay, all right. So, Professor, taking another point forward, we spoke about how Russia has clearly said that this issue in Ladakh is a bilateral issue between India and China, and Russia believes that it is up to India and China to directly deal with it. That is the stated objective, really, as far as Russia is concerned. But would Russia like to play a role behind the scenes as far as India and China are concerned in trying to sort out any kind of issue?
if you've been reading the comments of Russian ambassador in Delhi, Kudashev, he's been really calibrating his language very carefully, emphasizing on optimism that China and India are capable of doing things on their own. The moment Primakov conceived of RIC, Russia and other republics of Soviet Union were in mess as far as borders with China were concerned. And India-China border, of course, has been a big issue as well. So the template originally never wanted to bring in bilateral issues so that the RIC would survive. But we all understand all multilateral institutions take decades to develop their own template, their own institutions and culture. And until then, they remain nothing but compilation of bilaterals. So even when we are having this trilateral conversation, the language between the lines, the body language, gestures are constantly signaling bilaterals in that. And I think you have to watch the meeting yesterday, at least the part that was made public. Nothing but bilaterals. So I think Russia, again, which originally conceived of, never wanted to involve bilaterals because that would have really put this whole multilateral effort at jeopardy. So that is how bilaterals are not brought out. But bilaterals are at the back of mind all the time because Russia, as I keep saying, understands until China and India are on talking terms on the negotiating table, then their influence becomes completely negative and will undermine these multilateral groupings that Russia desperately needs to survive. So in that sense, I think bilaterals will keep kind of determining the nature of multilateral here. And, as the ambassador said, by the sidelines, between the meetings, these are always bilaterals that very often a lot of bilateral breakthroughs happen on the sidelines of multilaterals. So I think the timing of this meeting was really interesting that the three foreign ministers got to spoke to each other, and I'm sure sometimes there are things that are tacitly developed as an understanding. We will know those much later. But bilaterals are always part of multilaterals, and I think same was true of the RIC meeting that happened yesterday.
Absolutely. Talking about meetings and going forward, Mr. Sinha, there is a suggestion that the first ever meeting of the three defense chiefs also should take place at some point in time. Do you believe that is a good idea?
I would think it's a premature idea at this stage. The last thing India would want is to get into any kind of military multilateral dialogue. We've stayed away from that, and I think for very, very good reason. You use an institution like RIC to basically build on the areas of common interests. And that's how you can make it a success. And if you do beyond, if you're taking on too much on your agenda, things like trying to create an alternative financial order in the world, you'll fail. If you're trying to create a new security architecture in Eurasia, you're bound to fail. Because essentially, India and China have so different points of view, not just worldviews or interest. They are getting the defense chief to sit together other than sharing sandwiches and coffee. I really think nothing serious will come out of it. But I don't think so we should be going that route right now. There are enough other things, say third country issue like Afghanistan you can talk about. How best do we work together to stabilize the situation in that country? There's so much more. And the best form of mediation actually works when it is not announced as such. A gentle nudge here. India has been briefing the Russians. The Chinese have been briefing the Russians. Let us be clear. So you do very quiet diplomacy to be successful. You cannot negotiate controversial issues in public. So I think when Russia may want a defense meeting of defense chiefs, I would be very hesitant to really push that along. I would be very, very hesitant.
Okay, time now to get closing comments from all my panelists for the best way forward, starting first with you, Ambassador.
Well, the best way forward, first and foremost, is for India to decide in what way to have some kind of a dealing with China. We are very clear that we will keep the lines of communication open because diplomacy is very important, dialogue is very important. But we have to make sure that a message is given to China very clearly that there are going to be costs of this kind of a misadventure that they have engaged in. So we have to get the India-China equation, if I can call it, right before there can be any meaningful discussion on any other forum. And that will take a long time because the trust gap is huge and it's not going to be easily bridged. But that said, China is going to be India's neighbor. We are destined to live along with each other, and we have to find a way to at least have a working relationship which is in the best interest of both the countries.
Okay, all right, Professor.
I think fundamentally the fact that the trilateral meeting happened, the fact that Indian Defence Minister is on a 3-day visit to Moscow, the fact that he had an excellent meeting with the Vice Prime Minister, Borisov, the fact that India is now expediting the delivery of S-400 anti-missile systems. I think we have seen this whole 2 days events pushing relationship too much forward. And already China and India are on talking terms, but at the various levels. We are hearing that the long 11 hours meeting on the border yesterday has resulted in putting details of disengagement, and hopefully they will go back to status quo as far as Eastern Ladakh is concerned. So maybe we have crossed the peak as far as this tension issue is concerned at the moment, and the trilateral possibly had some role to play. India-China tensions will keep coming and going, but this episode, maybe now it's really going to take a U-turn from this stage.
Okay, all right. And Shakti Sinha, close the show for us with your concluding remarks.
Platforms like RIC will only make sense if China, as Jaishankar was very clear, plays by the rules of the game, not only in concept, but in practice also. If you push India too hard, which China seems to be doing at this moment, unfortunately, a situation may arise where India may find a body like RIC not worth its while if you go across to the other camp. So if China is really serious and Russia is serious, you have to bring down temperatures, not by telling people to cool down, but by making sure that people follow the rules of the game, do not cross lines, that in international affairs, you do not use force to change facts on the ground. If that is so, then there's lots of places where we can all three cooperate with each other in our larger, mutually beneficial arrangements.
Okay, all right. On that note, then I'll call it a wrap.